By the end of the 19th century, the concept of the Litvak had become well established in the Jewish world. Let me give a few literary examples. I'll begin with two by non-Litvaks. In one of his Hasidic tales, Zwischen zwei Berg, Between Two Mountains, Yitzhak Lebush Peretz, who, as I'm sure people will remember, was born in Zamość and lived most of his life in Warsaw, describes the conflict between the Hasidim and their mitnagdik or misnagdik opponents. He gives both sides their voice, but he clearly comes down, unlike Professor Brown, on the side of the former. The story recounts the clash between the Brisker Rov and his best pupil. Brisk, of course, is Yiddish for, in Polish, Brzeszcz Litewski. Today it's in Belarus and called Piest. And his best pupil, who has left him to found a Hasidic court. He explains why. Your Torah, Rabbi, is nothing but law. It is without pity. Your Torah contains not a spark of compassion. And that is why it is without joy, without air to breathe. It is nothing but steel and iron commandments, copper laws. It is a very refined Torah, suitable for scholars, for the select few. The Brisker Rov was silent, and so the Rebbe, of course, a Rov is a traditional rabbi, a Rebbe is a head of a Hasidic community. So the Rebbe continued, tell me, Rabbi, what have you got for ordinary people? For the woodchopper, the butcher, the tradesman, the simple man, and most especially for the sinful man. What do you have to offer those who are not scholars? To convince the Brisker Rov, the Biala Rebbe takes him to see his followers on Simchat Torah, the festival at which we commemorate the granting of the law. We must say the afternoon prayer, the Brisker Rov suddenly announced in his harsh voice, and everything vanished. Silence fell. This, of course, is told by the narrator, that is, Peretz himself. The curtain closed again before my eyes. Above me, an ordinary sky, and below, ordinary pasture. Ordinary Hasidim in torn kaftans, murmuring old tattered fragments of a song. The flames were extinguished. I looked at the Rebbe. His face too was somber. They did not reach an understanding. The Brisker Rov remained a misnagid just as before, that is, an opponent of Hasidism. And that was how he left Biala. Yet their meeting did have some effect. The Rov never again persecuted Hasidim. The Hebrew poet Shaul Chernichovsky, in his late 19th century account of a circumcision in a Jewish agricultural colony near the Black Sea, has a mock heroic description of a verbal duel between a Polish and a Lithuanian Jew. When they are served Carmel wine, that is wine from the Jewish settlements in the land of Israel, the Litvak objects. Shmerel then, the Melamed, raised his loud voice, saying, being Lithuanian, he was learned in Torah, although he was a radical. Listen, my friends, to the words of a Lithuanian Melamed. Thus did Shmerel begin, and then he gave a brief review of proletarian hardships as revealed in history. Hardship and famine and bitterness of hopeless oppression. The workers harder than rock, however, their many trials surviving, looking for help to the people, to all Israel everywhere. This red wine, what is it, if not the blood of our workers being shed in the fields of Zion, the hills of Judah? On your heads be their blood, if you should keep silent before the oppression of the Jewish colonization or organization, that is, the Rothschilds who have organized Jewish settlement, which is bringing all to destruction. Let me now give two Litvak accounts. The first is from Moshe Kulbak's poem, Vilna, written in the 1920s. In it, he gives a striking description of what Vilna meant in the eyes of the Litvak. The Vilna he loved was not a modern city, the home of such important Jewish cultural institutions as YIVO, the Strasham Library, the Yiddish Teachers Training College, or the Tarbut Gymnasium, which was described in the Jerusalem of the North yesterday. Instead, he evoked a city of the night, a city of mysticism, a city of poverty. You are a psalm spelled in clay and in iron, each stone a prayer, a hymn every wall. As the moon, rippling into ancient lanes, glints in a naked and ugly splendor, ugly cold splendor. Your joy is sadness, joy of deep basses in chorus. Your feasts are funerals, your consolation is poverty, clear, translucent, like a summer mist on the edges of the city. You are a dark amulet set in the rain, old grey writing, each stone a book, each parchment every wall. And a key element of Jewish Vilna was its love of Yiddish. This was a place where Jewish acculturation, whether to Polish or to Russian, not to speak of Lithuanian, was on a very small scale. And this love of Yiddish is shared by the poet. Yiddish is the homely crown of the oak leaf over the gates, sacred and profane, into the city. Grey Yiddish, which is the light that twinkles in the window, like a wayfarer who breaks his journey beside an old well. I sit and listen to the rough voice of Yiddish. Is that the reason why my blood is so turbulent? A very different view of what it was to be a Litvak is given by the Israeli writer Amos Oz in his lucid, moving autobiography. His father was for most of his life an unreconstructed rationalist. I quote him. My father had a distinctly Lithuanian temperament. He was a sentimental, enthusiastic man, but for most of his life he loathed all forms of mysticism and magic. He considered the supernatural to be the domain of charlatans and tricksters. He thought the tales of the Hasidim were mere folklore, a word which he always pronounced with the same grimace that accompanied his use of such words as jargon, a derogatory term for Yiddish. He was, of course, a Zionist and a proponent of Hebrew. Ecstasy, hashish, or intuition. Now, let me just conclude this section by quoting my own definition of the Litvak. This I put into a glossary in a volume of Polin, and this is what I wrote. A Jew from the territories of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Litva. In terms of Jewish stereotypes, the Litvak was a rationalist, an opponent of Hasidism, often a social radical, sometimes also a miser. To themselves, the Litvaks were the incarnation of all the finest Jewish values. That was my Litvak take on this. I have to say that the managing editor of Litman Library, probably correctly, but of course she's also a Polish Jew, censored the last sentence. Now, there are a number of concepts to be found here. The Litvak as a rigorous opponent of mysticism, although Kulbach takes a different position, and certainly the Mira Yeshiva and the third generation of the Musar movement was mystic in the sense that it sought internal transformation of human beings in order to make the performance of the commandments a necessary part of their identity. Radical, a rationalist, an exponent of Yiddish, a person who spoke Yiddish in a specific way, and the inhabitant of a cold, northern, impoverished country. George Orwell has said that a cliché is the easiest way to convey complex information in a condensed manner. In this sense, all of these characterizations, however cliched, do have an element of reality. So when did they emerge, and how did they become established? Now, the fact that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania retained many legal and constitutional features after the Union of Lublin in 1569 is now well established in historical study, among others in the works of Richard Butterwick, who I think is in the audience. I saw him there, he is at the back. But what is less clear is whether the position of Jews in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania differed significantly from those in the Korona, that is, in the crown or the Kingdom of Poland. Certainly, if we look at the legal position of the Jews, the nature of Jewish autonomous institutions and the social relationships of the Jews, there were very similar patterns in the pre-modern period, down to 1772, when this present volume begins, in the two areas. This is apparent, firstly, in the general charters granted to Jews. The Charter of Boleslav of Pius of 1264, the charter which basically organized or set down the legal structure of Polish Jewry, was the basis for the charter which was issued by Vytautas the Grand Duke in 1388 and confirmed again in 1507 by Zygmunt I in his capacity as the Grand Duke of Lithuania. A similar pattern can be seen in Jewish autonomous institutions, whether at the local level, the level of the Kehillah, or whether at the national level, the Council of the Four Lands in the Kingdom of Poland, or the Council of Lithuania in the Grand Duchy. There's also considerable similarity in the locations of Jewish life in Lithuania. Jews lived for the most part either in royal towns like Vilna or Brest, or in Warsaw, or in Krakow or Poznań, or in smaller towns under the control of the nobility, what came to be known as the Städtlach of Jewish historical memory. And the situation of the Jews in these smaller towns was very similar in both Poland and Lithuania. In addition, these smaller towns really developed in the particular way they did because of the relationship between the Jews and the Polish and the nobility. And one of the features of the whole of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is that throughout this area, the nobility, in the case of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, originally sometimes Polish, sometimes Lithuanian, and sometimes speaking Old Russian, became Polonized, and there is no difference, for instance, between the situation of the Jews on the Radziwiłł estates in Lithuania, as described by Adam Teller, or the situation of the Jews on the estates of the Lubomirski Sambushkos, the largest aristocratic landholding in 18th century Poland, mostly in southern and western Poland. Finally, there was little difference in relations between Jews and non-Jews over the Commonwealth as a whole. In Poland and in the Grand Duchy, Jews, as they were everywhere in Western Christendom, were tolerated in an inferior position in order to confirm the truths of Christianity, but at the same time they constituted a separate estate with guaranteed rights and performed specific economic functions which gave them an assured and fairly secure position. So what really led to the emergence of a specific and distinctive Litvak identity were the religious conflicts in the 18th century, which saw first the emergence of Hasidism and a special type of Hasidism in Lithuania, a more intellectual version of Hasidism. Perhaps it's rather strange to say this today, but when the first Lubavitch Rebbe emerged, the Chabad which he expounded was much more intellectual and was intended to convince the Vilna Gaon and the Misnagdic opponents of Hasidism that this was not a neo-messianic movement, repetition of the disastrous Sabbatean movement of the mid-17th century, or the Frankist movement of the 18th century, but merely a development of the traditional themes within the Jewish rabbinic thought. Not only did a specific form of Hasidism emerge in the lands of Lithuania, but also, as Professor Brown has developed, in order to deal with the Hasidim, the opponents of Hasidism, and of course Misnagid means in Ashkenazi Hebrew, or Mitnagid in modern Hebrew, means opponent, in other words, opponent of Hasidism. The second and third generation of these opponents of Hasidism realized quite quickly, Rabbi Salanter and the other figures that Professor Brown has described, realized it wasn't enough to oppose Hasidism. It was necessary to provide an alternative to Hasidism. And what developed was this specific form of Lithuanian spiritual identity, the Musarnika, as the deeply fervent but also spiritual individual who saw the commandments, I hope I'm summarizing you correctly, not as merely something that one needed like a robot to implement, but as a reflection of one's own inner transformation, that morality was what lay at the heart of Misnagdic and Musar, particularly Mira, but also Novaradik Musar belief. So this is the first aspect of the Jewish religious tradition, which was crucial. The second factor which led to the spreading of the stereotype of the Litvak was immigration. Now, in the 19th century, there was huge immigration within the Jewish community. We are mostly conscious of Jewish immigration overseas. Between 1880 and 1930, a total of 1.8 million Jews left the Tsarist Empire for the United States. The total number of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe at this time is probably around 2.5 million. This is what we are all conscious of, and many of them, of course, the ones who didn't go to the United States went to the Western Europe, to the United Kingdom, to South Africa, like my own family, to Australia, and spread throughout the world. But there was also very significant internal emigration within the Tsarist Empire in the 19th century. Jews emigrated from the less developed parts of the Tsarist Empire to those parts where there was significant commercial, industrial, and agricultural development in the 19th century. They moved from Lithuania, which was, or Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which of course is a larger area than the ethnic Lithuanian state, which emerged in 1918. They moved from this area, which saw little industrial development in the 19th century, to Ukraine, which in the 19th century became a major grain exporting area and also a very prosperous area. And they moved also to the Kingdom of Poland, statelet which was established at the Treaty of Vienna in order to reconcile, ultimately unsuccessfully, Polish national aspirations with the raison d'etat of the Tsarist Empire, where there was something like an industrial revolution in the 19th century. On the eve of the First World War, in the kingdom of the degree of urbanization in the Kingdom of Poland was higher than that in France. And when these Jews came, they brought with them, firstly, a degree of education. Many of them worked as melamdim, like the figure in the poem by Chernyakhovsky. Many of them became important activists within the Jewish community, and they brought with them their special traditions from Lithuania, which were often resented by Ukrainian or Polish Jews, and for whom they also felt a degree of, let's say, contempt for their, as they thought, uneducated and boorish character. I very well remember how a cousin of mine from Vilna described the Jewish porter. She couldn't get into a university in Vilna in the 1930s, so she studied in Liège, and she described going from Vilna to Warsaw by train, and the Jewish porters at the station in Warsaw, who couldn't speak, as she thought, proper Yiddish, and instead of saying ich, said yach. Now, the third feature in the development of the Litvak identity was the fact that in the 19th century, the Tsarist government sought to transform the Jews from a religious and cultural community, and this was a policy which was pursued everywhere in Europe, into subjects, useful subjects of the Tsar. They didn't want to transform them into citizens because there was no concept of citizenship in the Tsarist Empire. This was an autocracy. Until February of 1917, there was no constitution. But this policy involved attempting to transform the Jews by conscripting them into the army, by creating a network of Jewish schools headed by two rabbinical schools, one in Vilna and the other in Zhytomyr, which were intended to train an elite which could lead the Jewish world into modernity. These policies were pursued by a government which was not sympathetic to the Jews, and their end results were not successful. And after 1881, the Tsarist government, in the wake of the pogrom wave, abandoned these policies. But they did lead to the emergence of the Masculine in the Tsarist Empire, who were determined to transform the Jews into useful subjects. And in Lithuania, particularly in Vilna itself, which was the scene of a rabbinical school, the Haskalah took on a very specific form. This was an area without a single dominant national group. The Poles had been the dominant element here, but they were now being, particularly after 1831, severely persecuted by the Tsarist authorities. Any manifestation of Polish patriotic activity was met with severe repression, exile to Siberia at the best. And so the Russians were only beginning to establish themselves. Lithuanian culture was a culture of the peasants. So in this area, you got the development of a very specific Haskalah, in which the development of Hebrew and the development of a modern Hebrew, identified with people like Yehuda Leib Gordon, the major Hebrew poet of the Haskalah, became important. Finally, what contributed to the emergence of the Litvak concept, or the Litvak idea, was the fact that after 1881, when the Tsarist government rejected the idea of transforming the Jews into useful subjects, and Jews responded by rejecting integration as a possible solution to the situation of the Jews in the diaspora, and instead saw the Jews as either a national group like the other national groups, like the Lithuanians or the Ukrainians or the modern Polish nation, which were emerging at this time, or argued that only the destruction of the capitalist system and the establishment of the socialist millennium would enable the Jews to find their place in society. This new Jewish politics, this idea of the Jews as a national or as a part of the world proletariat, was particularly attractive to the Jewish elite in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And it's for these reasons that in this area, the new Lithuanian government, which was also sympathetic to the idea of Jews as Jews rather than Jews as Poles or as Russians, which of course, since Lithuania was determined to establish itself as an independent state and to establish its cultural identity, fostered this period of Jewish autonomy. The autonomous system, which emerged in 1918, was the product of the imperatives of the Lithuanian state, but it was also the result of the very specific character of the Jewish identity in Lithuania, the Litvak identity. As we know, this experiment failed, and the reasons, I think, are clear. The two sides had unrealistic expectations of each other. The Lithuanians believed the Jews would aid them in acquiring Vilna, and first in acquiring Memel, Klaipeda, and then in acquiring Vilna or Vilnius, and later in attracting Belarusians to a multinational Lithuania. They had much less need of the Jews in the fairly homogeneous Lithuania, which actually emerged, while it soon became clear that the Jews would not be a significant factor in acquiring Vilna. The Jews, for their part, probably took too seriously the assurances made by leading Lithuanian politicians. I say this in the presence of my student Šarūnas Liekas, who knows this much better than me, and I very much recommend his book on this topic. The commitment of the Lithuanians to Jewish autonomy was always dependent on their larger goals. There were other reasons for the failure of the experiment. It fell prey to the Lithuanian party conflict, and the degree of necessary consensus necessary for its success was absent within the Jewish community. It may also be that there is an inherent contradiction between the basic principles of the liberal state and the guaranteeing of group rights. This issue is just coming again before the US Supreme Court. It'll be very interesting to see how it is decided. What is left of the Litvak identity today? Most Jews seem to see it above all as a reflection of religious differences. What he understood by Litvak, he replied, "I am a spiritual Litvak because I believe in a rational approach to religious questions." Certainly the consciousness of the division between Litvak, Polak, Ukraina and Galiciana, not to speak of Romanian, in the Jewish world seems to have faded greatly. At the same time, the need to subject this phenomenon to a scholarly investigation remains important, and of course there are several articles in volume 25 which deal with this specific subject. Up to now, there have been few studies of the specific history of the Litvaks, and there are still many unanswered questions, and it's my hope that this conference will further this understanding, and that people from all the religious and national groups which made up the Grand Duchy of Lithuania will take part in this investigation. Thank you.